Well, welcome into a very exciting episode of The Scene. I'm your host, Bubba Starts, and with me today is the host of the Going In Blind podcast with Zach Tidwell. Zach Tidwell, welcome to the show, brother.
Thanks for having me on, man.
Well, this is great. I absolutely love the show. I'm a big fan already and a big fan of your story. So, without too many details, I guess we'll kind of give us a short version and then we'll talk about the podcast.
Yeah, I'll give you the shortest version possible. My name is Zach Tidwell. I'm 29 years old. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and I lost my sight almost 6 years ago to a suicide attempt when I shot myself in the head. So totally blind and deaf in one ear now, but I do all sorts of crazy stuff, including running my own business and public speaking and skiing and snowboarding and rock climbing and whitewater kayaking and competing in Brazilian jiu-jitsu against people without any disabilities and do a lot of stuff like this to try and discuss mental health and hopefully save lives. And the podcast is an extension of, over the past couple of years as I've shared my story more, especially through interviews and public speaking. I've met a lot of people with similarly incredible stories, not necessarily in the mental health space, but just people who have overcome stuff, but also people just doing interesting and big things out there, whether it's researchers working on interesting projects or founders of these big organizations that are spreading from national to international and really just kind of movers and shakers. And I want to help other people get their stories out there. And I like picking those people's brains. So that's what the podcast is all about.
That's amazing. I've said a lot lately that this is how God is speaking through us. Each one of us sharing our stories and the struggles that we've lived through, and obviously yours. You know, most people would never take that second lease on life, right? Surviving a suicide attempt and figure out how to turn that into a positive and to turn that into how am I going to keep anyone from feeling that way that I felt when I tried to take my own life. I have to imagine that that is the deep motivation for continuing to go on.
Yeah, and so I was a machine gunner in the Marines. Obviously, that is a you choose to do that in service of your country. When I got out of the Marines, I wanted to be an ER nurse, still wanted to help people. And when I was taken off of life support and had a bullet hole in my forehead and was completely blind, and along with everything else, I still want to help. Initially, I thought that would be going into psychology, and it led me down a different path, but I still have found these ways, especially as I've gotten comfortable in speaking about this stuff. Early on, as I had lost all my independence and was so dependent on everyone that I really struggled with that because it was, I hadn't lost my sight through an accident. I was the only one who could be held responsible for what I'd done and for letting myself get to the point of doing that. And so as I've gotten more comfortable and more in a good spot and dealt with all of these things, that has been okay. This is how I can spin that into a positive. Instead of counseling people, I can talk about this stuff. These are all big topics, very uncomfortable topics that people tend to avoid. And even with my podcast, it's not supposed to be a mental health podcast whatsoever. I'm literally just following my curiosity. But I just recorded the 14th episode yesterday, and I think maybe a third of the episodes so far have people have brought up their own struggles with suicidal ideations and deep depression and even in public speaking stuff. These issues, both suicide and substance abuse stuff, because I also struggled with alcoholism for a couple of years, are so much more common than you would ever realize, but people just don't talk about it. And so that's the hope here, is that it kind of opens those discussions. And also I I like to think that if I had heard a story like mine while I was in that decline towards my suicide attempt, that probably would have snapped me out of the irrational place that I was in. And that's the goal with all of it, is just that it helps someone else and gets someone off the ledge, or a family member who was left behind after a suicide attempt realizes that, hey, you're not to blame for that. Or someone who's watching a loved one go through substance abuse recognize, hey, it's okay to set your boundaries and distance yourself from that person if they aren't helping themselves. Like, we have to accept that the individual has accountability in these things. And that's also I'm flying through the second draft of a book that dives into all this stuff and really puts a lot of stuff that I'm not proud of in my own story out there for other people to see, but it's for the sake of getting these discussions started because I think a lot of healing can come from that.
No doubt. I mean, I've been living it. I came from the substance abuse side of this, right? The things that got me down, man, I should have died a few times because of my drug addictions. I guess I wouldn't call them suicide attempts, but I didn't care if I died or not, right? Eating handfuls of pills and then waking up and essentially pumping my own stomach, at one point when I was 19 years old. I mean, that was more than just curiosity and getting high. That was, and I don't give a shit about my own personal well-being, right? And doing drugs while I was selling drugs and falling asleep behind the wheel doing 80 miles an hour. And no, in itself, is it a suicide attempt? No, but it definitely could have killed me. I woke up just as my truck hit I took my, side view mirror off of my truck doing 80 miles an hour, woke up as I hit the rumble bars, came to high on methamphetamine. And, God had my back that day. And several times before that, I just wasn't listening, and I wasn't realizing that the path was so much different for me. I love that you've turned it into something that is going to save lives. Already, you're 13 episodes in, you just recorded your 14th episode. Already you have put something out there that will find someone in their deepest, darkest moments, right? We're not doing this for ourselves. I mean, this podcasting thing kind of found me. Now I'm 130 episodes in, and I've realized what it is when I say God is speaking through us. It isn't some kind of facetious, just to say it. I do believe that this is how we're going to heal one another, because it's, in my conversation with you, I'm already changing. And your conversation with your guests, you're already changing that one person. You're changing you. So if that can go out to the wider world and to change other lives, then it's a huge success. And your life now has not been for nothing. And even your suicide attempt is not for no reason, that it has some cause to it, right? Or at least some effect that is greater than the loss of one life. It's the changing of many lives. So I applaud you. It's not easy to put our shit out there, right? And
Yeah, it's definitely not, man. I mean, I'm sure I've come to terms with all that stuff now. Even still, though, I think and I'd be curious to know how you feel. For me, the alcoholism for sure still brings some embarrassment up. I don't feel it around the suicide attempt and the rest of my story. Just I think because I know where I was at, but the something I think because I was affecting so many other people with alcoholism that still to me is that's not a fun spot for me to admit and put out there, especially the way that it affected other people. But it does. I think when you have it in these conversations specifically, and it sounds like you do long form conversations as well, approaching these subjects in a natural manner and not honing on them. Like I said, my podcast isn't supposed to be a mental health podcast, but it does come up in these conversations while we're talking about other things because these people know my story. And there's value in that because there's no preaching going on. It's just other people laying their stuff out there for other people to, maybe recognize some similarities to being passed out and waking up high on meth while you're going 80 miles an hour down the road and being like, okay, maybe I need to get some help. He figured it out. What can I do here too?
right. Yeah. And my podcast started as about arts and music, man. And now it's kind of bled into podcasting and giving, people like you a chance to introduce themselves and introduce their own podcast. But I had to start a whole nother show because so much of our mental health and like the worst stories of my life kept bleeding into this was supposed to be a fun podcast. And I was like, maybe we should start to separate some of this stuff a little bit. and to leave a little more room for those deeper conversations. I think that's the purpose of this whole media form, right? Like, sure, we can get stoned for 3 hours and talk with Joe Rogan or listen to his buddies, and I enjoy that programming sometimes. But when I really started to dig into these conversations and felt the healing inside of myself, right? And I haven't done a lot of public speaking on these things. I play in a I write songs, right? I'm a songwriter and a performer. So I've gone out and I've shared a little bit about this and being to prison and other things, but I never had an opportunity to like tell the whole story. And it wasn't something that I could do just sitting down with someone, even for 3 hours. I couldn't tell you my whole story and all the details and all the moments that made me the man I am today. So having my own platform was really what unlocked this one. Oh, okay. Your story and all of the stories make much more sense when you're relating them to someone else's story. And it's something that I've never had a problem doing. But finding relationship with everyone that comes across my computer screen, and hopefully one day a beautiful studio that people can come in and share some time in person with, that's the mission of my life. Like, I have no other purpose at this point, other than to raise my kids, be a good husband, and to keep pulling on this thread and getting these conversations out there. It's so imperative to my life at this point. I can't imagine just like walking away.
Yeah, and I think that is why, like you said, when it's all laid out there like that and not with the preachy thing, it leaves that it's out there and it's for other people. Like obviously you and I get something out of doing this too. And I do, I feel I walk out of these conversations with stuff to ponder and to process and to think about. Okay, that was, I learned something from that, but laying it out there just raw like this, it leaves it open to interpretation and other people can take it or leave it. And that not talking at someone is, I think, is the important key and why this medium really does resonate with people.
So talk about that. I mean, you're 14 episodes in now. Obviously you're motivated to keep on going. What kind of guests are you having on the program, and what kind of, what's your vision for the future of what the podcast is?
I am following my curiosity with it. Again, the caveat there being that these are people who are accomplishing things, right? It's or lessons hard learned. I've I drop episodes every Monday, but I'm also doing an episode on the first Friday of every month. So the episode that comes out this Friday was with a self-proclaimed prophet, and we just explore. I let him say what he has to say and do my own kind of probing and being kind and letting him say his course, but also pointing out, okay, here's a hole. Like, can you speak to that kind of thing? But I've got a former Navy SEAL coming on, a Super Bowl winner who's had 9 brain surgeries from all of the head injuries that he's had, a former junkie turned judge who's coming on. I just had the guy that I had on yesterday. His name is Travis Holzum, and he's in the regenerative agriculture space. Trying to get someone to come on and talk about prison and education reform. I'm talking to pretty much everybody, just anyone who piques my curiosity and who I feel can have an interesting conversation for an hour, hour and a half. That's where we're going.
And that's kind of the thread that I talk about pulling on with my own podcast, is like, well, what am I interested in, and what moves me, and I had to start 5 different shows to kind of pique all of those interests, because I don't know that anyone can follow me on all the different tangents that I like to run down. But a big focus of what I'm doing is to talk to podcasters, right? A big part of what my life has become is like, well, instead of finding all the interesting people, like all of the people, if you've chosen to start your own podcast and to pursue this, you're pretty interesting. So I think the last, 7 or 8 interviews I've done have all been with people who have started their own podcasts and are kind of pulling on the same threads. And and chasing that curiosity down. I think that's the only way we're going to learn anything about, this life, because so much of what is kind of shoved in our faces. And, what'd you say? You're 29 now?
Yep. Yep.
I'm almost 10 years older than you, right? And my whole life has been full of, a bullshit story, to put it pretty blatantly, like, what you saw on TV and in advertising and all of these things were just so far from what was actually happening in the real world, that it's become even more imperative now to do what we're doing, to lift the veil of life, and to just expose it, and to do that in anything, right? From prophets to prison guards, or
Yeah.
prisoners. I was one myself at one point.
Yeah. And I get it's everyone has a story. And I'm so, when you can get people kind of unreeling the thread there of it and just talking about it, it's, it is interesting, but I really do, whatever area it's in, you do learn things. And that's been my favorite part so far. And that's everybody, like I said, especially with the mental health stuff coming up, everyone has their own shit going on that you would never realize. Everyone has their own story behind things. And I think that all of those things in combination, and when you take into perspective as well what these people are doing, this the NFL player that's coming on that was a Super Bowl winner is also, despite all this crazy stuff he has going on in his life, is a wildlife biologist now, and a very active one. And I want to know what takes you from being the caveman that was playing on the 49ers front line to now you're nerding out on chinchillas. I don't know. It's just people are interesting, and I love being able to lay that stuff out there and help people get their stories out.
And I think one thing that we forget as humans is, like, you go through cycles in your life. Like, I'm not the same man I was at 25 running drugs and doing, like, I'm not even close to that guy anymore. And in 10 years from now, I'm not going to be close to the person that I am even today. Hell, a year ago, Zach, I was still welding and going to a factory every day. And about a year ago, it would have been later this month, it'll be a whole year. I walked away from that job and I thought I was going to be a rock star. My band was playing some really cool gigs. We were getting some great opportunities. I was on the local news. I was getting radio play. I was like, here we go. We're about to live that rock star dream finally. And then by April, I was, had this little podcast that wasn't much, had a great summer with the band and kept doing a few interviews here and there. And then by September, October, I was doing, 4 interviews a day. And the schedule started filling up to now I do, a minimum of 12 interviews a week. And I'm developing other podcast shows for other people and, dragging that story out. Like, I didn't know I was going to be here a year ago. How are we going to know where we're going to be in a decade? And I think finding out kind of like who everyone was 10 or 20 years ago and building it up to now, that it gives us a much better vision of what the future could hold, right? When we actually look and we see the launch pad for what it is, instead of making assumptions about who people are, whether they were a soldier or whether they were a felon like me, that doesn't define who we are. And even one, life-changing moment, like an attempt on your life or something, that doesn't define you for the rest of your life.
It
And
can if you let it. Like you could have been the felon that doesn't go on and do anything with your life. That was a choice for you to move on from that. And I think a lot of people get stuck in that stuff. Okay, there's a decision point there where you could be working a job at McDonald's and being, oh, I can't get a job because I have a record, but you didn't. That's the key thing. And I think laying that stuff out there and also seeing like, okay, there's a trend here that people don't know what they're doing as they go through life. They just kind of figure it out as they go. And in searching for these things, you will stumble across something that pulls on you. Like it sounds like you have found your lane now and this is your thing. And I similarly, after I got back into college, after I shot myself, I started going for clinical psychology, and what I mentioned earlier with kind of stumbling down a different road. I wound up dropping out of college to become a software developer because I saw how inaccessible the world was for people with disabilities. And now that's what I do. I've won some awards doing it. And like, but again, something I never would have thought that I would do. And like you're saying, having that out there just laid out for other people to see is so valuable and it can help people and someone else. And you probably have listeners, even if you haven't heard from them yet, who have also been to prison and are hearing that and seeing hope in the fact that, okay, this dude's out there getting after it still. And maybe I need to get off this little pity party that I'm throwing myself and do that too.
Exactly. And be a man of action or a woman of action and to just get out there and do it. You can't let these memories, because that's all they are. You can't let your memories define you and to keep telling your story. And I think that's the power of the podcast is like you lay your story out there and then it's there. You don't necessarily have to like keep going back and retelling that story to yourself. It's out there. Now what are you going to do? Right? And for me, it's been incredibly therapeutic to just come on and share my story and I can talk about things now with you, Zach, that I wasn't able to talk about with my own family 5 years ago and to get into, and that I was masking with alcohol and drugs and a lot of these things and a lot of these deep feelings that just having conversations mostly with complete strangers that then become really good friends. It's such a beautiful thing, and I can't stop, and I'm sure you feel the same way. I admire you for the getting out and realizing the plights of what is affecting blind people. Had you would have never had that had you not become blind yourself, right? And like how much now is, yes, that moment, while it could have defined you in a bad way, now defines you in a much different way because you have this thing that you otherwise wouldn't have had, this struggle, this mountain to overcome, but you're not just climbing over it yourself. You're building a ladder so that people behind you can climb over it much easier.
Yeah, and I think that all, and it sounds like it has for you too. It kind of stems from finding a purpose after your circumstances have changed and as you're changing as a person. It doesn't have to be something so dramatic as shooting yourself in the face, but you can have these moments where, yeah, okay, I need to find something else that drives me and it will carry you in these new directions that might light a new fire under your ass. And there will always be people out there, I'm sure you've probably run into them with your own story, where they can't look past the fact that you have been convicted of something and they're assholes about it. I get the same thing with the suicide stuff. And I'm like, okay, you don't understand and you haven't been there and that's okay. But fuck those people. They're not, those are the people that you want to surround yourself with.
Well, and not that I need to point it out to you, but to point it out to our listeners and anyone who happens to hear this. Um, your own life was not the first life that you had taken or attempted to take, right? A machine gunner in the Marines, you have taken lives,
I
right?
haven't. I'm not a combat vet. I deployed
Okay.
twice, but I didn't see war. But
Okay. Well,
yeah.
you were still trained to do so. Like, and being in that environment, life becomes, unfortunately, a little cheaper. And it's something that they're never going to understand. Unless you've been there, you're not going to understand. And the only way that they can try to understand you is by listening to your stories and listening to you converse with other people. Like that's the only way to get to that point.
Yeah, and doing it with an open mind. That's they kind of have to meet you halfway there, or at least be somewhat open to hearing someone else out. But I think that that's a almost not even a skill, a trait that at least I've noticed, trying to date as a dude in my 20s that I feel like people have lost or it seems to not be very prevalent. And I think the fact that podcasts are continuing to grow is a good sign that maybe people are starting to move back in the right direction, coming out of the social media and short form content kind of phase of the 2010s.
The 2020s.
Yeah, yeah, I guess we're in 2025 now, so that's probably
Right.
safe to say too. Yeah, TikTok is still out there booming, but
Yeah, well, and I think I don't spend any time on TikTok at all. I don't have it on my phone, but what I've heard from a lot of people, and especially when it headed towards the shutdown, was not only did, some people lost their livelihoods and were making, a considerable amount of money there, but they had connected with community. And I think it was a lot easier on that app because of their algorithm to find community, to find stuff that you were interested in. And granted, the content was short form. I think it was working. And I think it was unlocking some stuff in people and restructuring the way that people's brains work. And yeah, we're kind of getting off those dopamine hits. Everybody's just depleted. I think that's what it
Yes.
comes down to. Well, it's all like we've been at a rave for fucking 15 years. Nobody's got any dopamine left to hit, and you're just kind of left in that afterglow of the party where you're like, man, my life's a fucking mess. Can we do something about this now?
Yeah, you're in that hangover where you're like, okay, what did I just do with my life last night? And what what adjustments do I need to make now moving forward? But it's not like it's all bad stuff that's on there. I do, but I recognize there's also educational content on all these platforms and stuff, but there's also a lot of hawk to a spit on that thing kind of stuff. And you're like,
Right.
all right, this isn't helping. This is not a net positive for society.
We are trying to counterbalance the Hawk Tua. That's what guys
Yeah.
like me and you like. Let's put out some really good stuff and yeah, just keep pulling on them. I mean, we went from one show that was running, 4 or 5 days a week with content to now I have four different feeds, a fifth one on the way. And we're just trying to get as many shows out there, running daily content and putting it out there. And if not all the episodes find everyone in a day, like you can't look at your downloads and be negative because that thing that you did today hasn't reached someone yet. Like it takes time for reverberations. Like even if you toss a pebble into a pond, right? If you toss it out in the middle of that pond, it's going to take a long time for it to reach you and to get back and then to start resonating with other people. So I think what you're doing is great. Any way that I can support your podcast and any endeavors that you're going into and causes that are important to you, that's the function of the Scene Projects, to help these nonprofits and podcasters get their voice out there. And the blessing of financial stability and all of that, that's going to come just from doing this, from naturally being someone who is supporting other people. That's where my success will come from, and that's why I won't stop. And I'm not going to become money motivated in this thing now when I've never been money motivated in my life.
Well, and that doesn't chasing that wouldn't lead to genuine conversations, right? That's if you're doing it out of a real interest and a true rooted passion for it and interest in these people that you're talking to, it will come. You just have to give it time. But if you start chasing other things, you're gonna kind of lose motivation for it, and that's gonna show, and the quality of what you're doing would show accordingly. So that's awesome, man.
Well, you're awesome, Zach. I really appreciate your time this morning. Why don't you go ahead and tell everybody where they can find the podcast and anything more about you, and I'll let you get out of here.
Yeah, Going In Blind with Zach Tidwell is available anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you do listen to it and you like it, please subscribe to it, leave a rating and a review. That helps me out a lot. And also, if you want to be kept up to date with my book, I do my public speaking website and my what will become my author website is zachtidwell.net. And I have a mailing list there. It's not spammy. I've had it for over a year. It is and haven't sent anything out yet. It will just be for announcements with the book as that comes out. But you can also reach out to me there to book me for speaking engagements.
Well, Zach, I can't wait to read the book when it comes out, and I hope I get to sit in the crowd and to listen to one of your speaking engagements as well. Zach Tidwell, thanks for being part of the scene.
Thank you, sir.